What does it look like when an entire worldview shatters in a single glance? For German soldiers, fed a steady diet of propaganda depicting a weak, decadent, and collapsing America, the answer came on the morning of June 4, 1943. At the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, Unoffizier Herman Butcher gripped the ship's railing as he stepped onto American soil, his legs still unsteady from a 14-day Atlantic crossing. Through the haze, he saw not the ruin he'd been promised, but a vision of terrifying power. The base sprawled across thousands of acres, its docks stretching beyond sight. But it wasn't just the scale that shocked him. It was the people. American dock workers, both white and black, worked side by side, operating machinery that seemed to belong to a future century. Women in coveralls confidently operated massive cranes, and civilians didn't even flinch at the sight of enemy uniforms. This wasn't a nation on its knees. This was a nation that didn't even seem to notice they were at war. The sight was so impossible, so utterly contradictory to his reality, that it would mark the beginning of a profound unraveling. Everywhere the prisoners looked, the indoctrination unraveled further. Nazi propaganda had painted a portrait of a decadent society on the verge of collapse, yet the reality was one of casual, almost arrogant, normalcy. Civilians wandered freely near massive military installations, vendors sold coffee and donuts within sight of warships, and a brass band played popular music at a nearby war bond rally. There was no fear, no paranoia, no sign of a nation under strain. This profound disconnect between propaganda and reality led Herman Butcher to whisper to the man behind him, "Die Spinnen, die Amos." The Americans are crazy. It wasn't just a stray thought. It was the only logical conclusion for a mind trying to reconcile the impossible. How could a nation at war with the Third Reich refuse to act like it? This question would hang over the prisoners, demanding an answer that their entire ideology was unprepared to provide. The processing at Norfolk began with what Butcher would later call the first impossibility. German military doctrine, practiced from Poland to Africa, held that prisoners were either assets to exploit or burdens to minimize. The Geneva Convention was a document acknowledged only when convenient and ignored when not. The prisoners braced for the worst, expecting to be treated as less than human. Instead, they were met with the rule of law. American officers stood before them, reading the Geneva Convention rules in fluent German, methodically explaining their rights and even asking about dietary needs. The true shock, however, came from a gesture of unimaginable consideration. Jewish American personnel, some with clearly Jewish surnames, began distributing Red Cross packages while explaining that kosher meals were available for any Jewish prisoners. Several of the Wehrmacht soldiers laughed nervously, assuming it had to be some kind of cruel mockery. It wasn't. The American military had actually prepared for the religious dietary requirements of its enemies. An act of humanity so profound and unexpected, it felt more alien than anything they had witnessed on the battlefield. The psychological disorientation continued as the prisoners began their 3-day train journey to camps in the interior. In stark contrast to the secretive and brutal prisoner movements in Germany, which often involved being packed into boxcars, the Americans made no attempt to hide them. The men were put on actual passenger coaches with cushioned seats, a comfort that felt deeply unsettling. Through the windows, America unfolded like a deliberate display of invincibility. They rolled past massive industrial areas that should have been camouflaged, but instead, factories brazenly displayed their names in huge letters. At the Glen L. Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore, they could see parking lots overflowing with workers' personal automobiles and count the finished B-26 bombers lined up for delivery, all in plain sight of the enemy. There was no security paranoia, just the hum of an industrial titan operating with absolute confidence. The most surreal moment came at Union Station in Washington, D.C. As hundreds of civilians watched, the prisoners' train shared a platform with another train carrying American soldiers off to training camps. Through the glass, the Germans saw wives kissing their husbands goodbye in public, children waving flags, and teenagers sharing milkshakes at the station restaurant. Enemies and families, separated only by a window and a few guards who seemed more interested in directing traffic than watching prisoners. It was a scene of startling, intimate normalcy that felt more powerful and intimidating than any military parade. Through Pennsylvania, the night sky glowed orange from blast furnaces that never stopped, and workers' houses with gardens and radio antennas spread for miles. But of all the displays of overwhelming power, the most psychologically devastating moment was small, quiet, and profoundly human. At a stop in Harrisburg, the German officers watched American workers at a shift change, men carrying lunchboxes, wearing leather shoes and wristwatches. According to Butcher's memoir, One of these laborers took a bite of an apple, seemed to find it unsatisfactory, and casually threw the half-eaten fruit away before opening his lunchbox to get a fresh one. This simple, thoughtless act of waste stunned men who had seen their own soldiers literally fight over scraps of food in the deserts of North Africa. More than any factory or warship, that discarded apple was the ultimate symbol of American abundance, a level of prosperity so immense that perfectly good food could be treated as garbage. Their final destination was Camp Hearne, Texas, a place where the scattered moments of American strangeness would become their daily reality. The infrastructure itself challenged their entire understanding of how to treat an enemy. This was no dreary stalag. Prisoners were housed in wooden barracks with electric lights, not oil lamps. Each building featured indoor plumbing with flush toilets and hot water heaters. Instead of straw pallets, each man was assigned an individual bed with a mattress, sheets, and a blanket. There were even recreation halls equipped with ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and libraries. The conditions were so exceptional that they were officially documented by outside observers. In an August 1943 report, Swiss inspector Emil Sandstrom, a neutral party from the International Red Cross, wrote what the prisoners were all thinking. He stated, "Conditions at Camp Hearne exceed not only Geneva Convention requirements, but surpass living conditions many of these men knew in Germany." This wasn't just imprisonment. It was an introduction to a standard of living that was, for many, better than what they had fought to defend back home. The next layer of psychological disorientation came directly from the camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, a man who had studied German at university and addressed the arriving prisoners in their own language. He explained the camp rules, but then announced something so unprecedented it bordered on the absurd. The prisoners would largely govern themselves. They were to elect their own spokesman, organize their own activities, and manage their schedules within military requirements. To the German military mind, steeped in the rigid hierarchy of the Führerprinzip or leader principle, this was pure insanity. Power was something you imposed, not something you gave away, especially to your enemy. This act of trust was so alien to their worldview that they could only process it in two ways. It was either a sign of stunning American weakness and naivete, or it was an elaborate trap designed to encourage dissent and identify troublemakers. The idea that it could simply be a better way to manage people was, at the time, unthinkable. Nothing prepared them for the camp canteen. If self-governance was a political paradox, the canteen was an economic one. A store where prisoners could spend script earned from voluntary labor on personal luxuries. The shelves were stocked with goods that went far beyond basic needs: cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing materials, art supplies, and even musical instruments. The War Department's logic, documented in official records, was that providing small comforts would maintain prisoner morale and reduce escape attempts. But to the German soldiers, this was baffling. Their own doctrine was built on breaking the will of their enemies, not boosting their spirits. The simple act of shopping, of being able to make a choice, to purchase a want instead of just receiving a need, was a profound psychological disruption. It was a bizarre and unexpected introduction to American consumer culture, scrambling their military mindset by treating them not as a defeated enemy horde, but as individuals. By September 1943, the abstract concept of American scale became a hands-on reality. With severe labor shortages impacting the Texas economy, the War Manpower Commission authorized the employment of prisoners in agriculture and other non-military industries. Prisoners who chose to work earned 80 cents per day in canteen script, a figure made all the more astonishing by the fact that it was the same base pay as an American private. At the legendary King Ranch near Kingsville, they encountered agriculture on a scale that defied European comprehension. The ranch covered 825,000 acres, an area larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. Here, German soldiers, indoctrinated in theories of racial purity, found themselves working alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands. The efficiency of this mixed-race workforce, focused on tasks rather than ideology, presented a direct challenge to Nazi doctrine. But it was the mechanization that felt truly alien. A single combine harvester did the work of dozens of men, and trucks, not horse-drawn wagons, moved the crops. Most incredibly, the ranch used its own fleet of small civilian airplanes to survey the vast cattle herds from the sky. It was a direct, undeniable assault on their understanding of labor, race, and efficiency. Working on local Texas farms exposed the prisoners to something far more powerful than industrial machinery: the American political character. FBI monitoring reports, declassified decades later, noted the profound shock German POWs experienced as they listened to American farmers complain openly and freely about President Roosevelt and his government's policies. In a nation engaged in total war, this level of open dissent seemed like madness. One documented incident at a farm near Bryan, Texas, crystallized this impossibility. An angry farmer, furious over a dispute about crop allocations, bluntly told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell. The prisoners who witnessed this braced for an immediate, violent response. They came from a world where such an insult to a state official would mean a death sentence. Instead, the inspector simply left, and the farmer faced absolutely no consequences. This wasn't just freedom of speech. It was a demonstration of a society so stable and so confident in its foundations that it did not need to rule by fear. To the German soldiers, it was a terrifying and incomprehensible display of a different kind of power. Working in the fields, the efficiency of mixed-race work crews had already chipped away at Nazi theories of racial purity. But at Camp Hearne, the challenge became direct and personal. German POWs, products of an ideology centered on Aryan supremacy, found themselves taking orders from Black American soldiers of the 359th Infantry Regiment. Several prisoners, so ingrained in their beliefs, even requested transfers rather than submit to the authority of a black man, requests the camp administration promptly denied. Yet, this jarring experience was immediately followed by a bizarre hypocrisy that was even more confusing. When taken into the nearby town of Hearne, the German prisoners discovered they could eat in restaurants that refused service to the very black soldiers guarding them. They could sit in parts of a movie theater where their own guards were forbidden to go. This was the ultimate paradox. As enemies of the state, they were afforded more social freedom in some contexts than the American citizens who happened to be black. This complex, contradictory reality scrambled their ideological certainty, presenting a picture of race in America that was nothing like the simplistic propaganda they had been taught. While many of these ideological shocks happened by chance, there was also a deliberate, sophisticated, and secret reeducation program underway, orchestrated by the Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office. This wasn't a crude propaganda campaign, but a quiet intellectual insurgency, and its primary weapon was the camp library. Initially stocked with 500 books from Hearne citizens, the library grew to over 5,000 volumes. Crucially, the shelves were filled with works by German and Jewish authors banned by the Third Reich. A German prisoner could walk into the library and freely check out books that would have meant a death sentence to possess back home, including Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain and Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Beyond the library, Sam Houston State Teachers College provided correspondence courses, with hundreds of POWs enrolling in subjects like American history and agricultural science. American professors even visited the camp to give lectures. The transformation was most visible in the camp newspaper, Der Spiegel. Early editions from 1943 were filled with Nazi talking points, but by late 1944, its pages were hosting open, democratic debates. America was dismantling their ideology not with lectures, but by reintroducing the very ideas their government had tried to burn. If the subtle dismantling of their ideology was a slow-acting poison, then Christmas of 1943 was a sudden, fatal blow. In an act of radical empathy, the entire town of Hearne, Texas, population 2,000, mobilized to provide a proper Christmas celebration for its enemies. The local newspaper, the Hearne Democrat, published a full list of donations, a document of staggering generosity. Local churches collected 4,800 individual gift packages. Most incredibly, the American Legion Post 164, comprised of World War I veterans who had fought the Germans, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment to their former enemies' sons. In the main compound, a 30-foot Christmas tree stood decorated with electric lights that burned continuously, an unthinkable display of abundance for a war-torn Germany living in blackouts. But the true turning point came in the form of a song. The First Methodist Church choir learned German Christmas carols phonetically so they could perform for the prisoners. The performance was led by the choir director, Mrs. Sarah Patterson, a woman whose own son was, at that very moment, serving in Italy, fighting the German army. The sight of American mothers singing carols to the very soldiers their own sons were fighting was a cognitive dissonance so powerful that, according to guard reports, it broke several prisoners emotionally. This wasn't propaganda or a trick, it was a devastating act of humanity. The emotional impact of this kindness offensive was profound, but was the transformation real? The official records and post-war data provide a clear and undeniable answer. This was not a momentary flicker of sentiment. It was a measurable, ideological shift, and the numbers are staggering. Out of 425,000 German prisoners held in America, only 2,222 escape attempts ever occurred. a minuscule rate of 0.52%. Incidents of sabotage were practically non-existent, with only 7 confirmed cases. In stark contrast, the rate of positive engagement was overwhelming. A full 87% of all eligible prisoners chose to participate in voluntary labor programs. The most compelling proof, however, came after the war was over. Surveys conducted by American occupation authorities on the repatriated soldiers revealed the lasting impact of their time in the United States. A remarkable 74% of the returned POWs now held favorable views of American democracy. The numbers didn't just suggest the program was successful. They proved that the American experiment in radical humanity had worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Behind these statistics are thousands of individual stories of transformation, but a few stand out as perfect emblems of this ideological shift. Take Herman Butcher, the same soldier who stepped off the gangplank in disbelief. He arrived at Camp Hearne as a convinced Nazi. For him, the turning point was the impossible kindness of Christmas 1943.
He later wrote, "These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts. Their kindness wasn't weakness but strength, the confidence of victors." After the war, Butcher legally immigrated to America in 1953, became a citizen, and worked as an engineer for General Motors until his retirement. An even more dramatic story is that of George Gartner. In 1945, he escaped from a camp in New Mexico, not to flee the country, but because he was terrified of being sent back to a destroyed Germany. He chose to remain in America illegally, living for 40 years under the assumed name Dennis Wiles. During that time, he married an American woman, raised a family, and worked as a tennis instructor in California. When he finally surrendered for a television documentary in 1985, he had been living as an American longer than he had been German. His choice to escape into America is perhaps the ultimate validation of the society he experienced as a prisoner. The impact of this transformation didn't end at America's borders. The final chapter of this story was written in the ruins of a defeated Germany, where the returning prisoners of war became crucial agents of democratic change. Having witnessed a functioning democracy firsthand, they brought back more than just memories. They brought back a blueprint for a new society. The influence of these men on West German Reconstruction is documented in occupation records. 48 former POWs were elected as members of the new German Bundestag, the federal parliament. 312 served as mayors or city councillors, rebuilding their communities from the ground up. Thousands more became quiet leaders in their fields. Over 1,800 worked to modernize German agriculture using American techniques, while more than 4,100 managed businesses modeled on the American methods of efficiency and worker morale they had observed. As former POW and later industrialist Hans Georg von Stunitz explained, "We returned from America with knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets operate. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked." The seeds of post-war German democracy were sown, unexpectedly, in the prison camps of America. In the end, the German prisoners of war who reached America witnessed a power far greater than anything on the battlefield. They came expecting to find a weak, decadent, and divided nation, just as their propaganda had promised. Instead, they discovered a society so confident in its own strength that it could afford to show mercy to its mortal enemies, and so free that it allowed dissent even in the midst of total war. America's greatest victory in the Second World War wasn't accomplished through bullets or bombs, but through the quiet, undeniable force of its own reality. The transformation of these soldiers was achieved not through indoctrination, but through exposure, not through hatred, but through humanity. The unusual sights they witnessed, mundane to Americans but revolutionary to them, proved that the most effective way to defeat an ideology is to simply show its followers a better one.